This is Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell, all talk and all crime. A killer Smog, a serial killer, the true story of the strangling of a city, death by two ways in post-war London. That's tonight on Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. Kate Winkler Dawson is a seasoned documentary producer. She teaches journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. This is her first book, I believe, and she's in fact right now on the line with us from Austin. The book is called Death in the Air, the true story of a serial killer, the Great London Smog, and the strangling of a city. Welcome, Kate.
Thanks for having me, Jim. I appreciate it.
You clearly get a sense that you're a storyteller and a documentarian. You got a lot of history in this as well. Tell us first off, is this 100% true, and how'd you pick it?
100% true. And I picked it because I was searching for another book. So air pollution was not something at the time that I was particularly passionate about. And I was just clicking through the internet like I usually do. And I like to explore Getty, which is a photo archive. And I was kind of hanging out on Getty, looking around at different photos, and I found this just arresting photo of this woman in a black and white photo from 1952. It was published in 53, and she's got this scarf wrapped around her face, and she has sort of a scared look on her face. And it's a beautiful photo, and thank goodness it's the cover of the book.
Yeah.
And I looked at the caption, and it said, it was a description of the Great Smog of 1952. And I thought, well, this is pretty amazing. I gravitate towards subjects that are really visual because that's my background. So it's important to me to really be able to build this world that really existed, but to be able to take people back to that time period, and it has to be visual. So I started looking at other photos before I even read much information about the smog, and I thought the photos were amazing and beautiful and tragic. People really struggling to get through it. And then there's some footage from the BBC. And then I really started reading about it and found out that it was the world's deadliest air pollution disaster, with initially the government said 4,000 people dead, and then later on we discover it's 12,000 people dead from a 5-day-long smog. And that was stunning to me. And what was more stunning is no one had written about it. So I continued exploring that idea for about 6 months, tracking down real-life characters who had lived through the smog, and it was important to me to find kind of a wide array of people who represented London society at the time. So in the book, there's a young doctor, there's a young police officer, there's a girl who's 13 whose father had bronchitis from living in pollution and traveled home, walking home 2 hours through the smog because the entire city was shut down, and came home and was essentially dying, and she was trying to save his life. So I found these really amazing characters, including a politician who later on was involved and really led the clean air fight in London. But I started looking through the archives, the New York Times and the Times of London for 1953. So the smog happened in December of 52. And in 53 is really when all of the newspaper articles were coming out about the number of people dead. There just really wasn't very much. And at about March of 53, at that section of newspapers, of course, it was difficult to not notice a serial killer on the run in London. And it was Reginald Christie, who's fairly well known in London and almost virtually unknown in the United States. And it made it even more difficult to find fog. The fog was, if it was in the archives starting in 53, it was rarely mentioned, and it was on the back page because the serial killer had taken over the headlines. And it was very frustrating for me as a researcher, but it was also interesting to see how these two stories converged in the media and in Parliament. There was a debate over the death penalty at the same time as there was debates over air pollution. And so it just is really, for our times, it resonates, I think, with contemporary readers, because this is what happens. We get a dramatic or inaccurate tweet, and all of a sudden the media and the public is sent into a tailspin over something that probably turns out to be a non-issue or a salacious story, and we're derailed from national conversation that we should be having over the environment, over criminal justice, North Korea, all these subjects that really affect our lives. And I just think we're very easily distracted by really sexy stories, and that's what happened.
Interesting.
That's what happened.
And also there's another link. There's a lot of bitterness, anger towards immigrants at the time. Tell us exactly the post-war conditions in London, and also why was there this bad smog? You talk about cheap coal. Was there no choice?
There really wasn't. And, so just to set the scene, so this is 7 years after the end of World War II. You're talking about a city that's just been bombed and a government that's bankrupt because of World War II. So this is Winston Churchill's government. He was ailing in health, but he's still considered a very strong leader because of how he handled the war. So you've got a bankrupt government. You've got buildings that haven't been able to be rebuilt because there's no money. Very high unemployment, high crime, a small police force because of the budget. And so there were areas that we now consider in London to be really posh, like Notting Hill, that were sort of ghettos. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that, stems from, as we talked about before, the poverty and the crime. And a lot of the fog and the frustration that comes with the fog was really traced back to coal. So in 52, coal was the main source of energy, of fuel. So there was gas and oil and electric, but it was too expensive, and there was just no way it was going to be. Those were going to be predominant sources of fuel. So it was coal, and because the government was bankrupt, they were forced to sell the black, quote unquote, clean coal, which was the coal that had very high carbon content, low moisture. And when it burned, it put out heat and some smoke and obviously some toxins, but really it was, an effective heat source. Unfortunately for Londoners, that heat source was rationed. And just a few days before the smog, the government lifted the rations on this cheap, brown, crumbly, dirty coal that was nicknamed Nutty Slack. It had very low content of carbon. You had to burn essentially 4 times the amount to get the same heat as you would with black coal, and it created more smoke. So it was a lot of dust and little tiny nuggets of cheap coal. And that's what Londoners burned. And this lifting of that ration happened 4 days before the smog started. So people ran out and bought all this coal, and it was already a polluted city to begin with. So you've got 20,000 steam-powered, locomotives churning out pollution, sulfur dioxide, and carbon monoxide. And you've got the government had decided to eliminate its electric tram system. So it was replaced by these beautiful red double-decker buses that we associate with London, except they were diesel-fueled. So you're talking about an awful lot of exhaust and toxins coming that way. There were millions of vehicles, but really the predominant cause of the pollution were more than 8 million people burning cheap coal in their fireplaces. The beginning of December were the coldest days that London had experienced, since the previous winter. And there was this anticyclone, which is a kind of a fancy word for a high-pressure system that floated over London and stayed there and trapped the cold air at the bottom. It was cold, moist air under a layer of warm air, and it created a fog. And within that fog, the pollutions mixed in, and it created this smog that was yellow and stinky and thick. And normally what's happened in the past is you've got a nice light wind that comes in, maybe a low-pressure system, and pushes this high-pressure system away, and then there are clear skies, and the pollution is able to float into the atmosphere. And that's just not what happened this time. It was a freak weather occurrence, and it lasted 5 days. And it lasted so long that, the world's most populated city and the world's most industrialized city was just under siege, and people were dying in the hospitals and at home.
And the government somehow denied that there was a link for the air quality to the deaths at the time. We're talking with Kate Winkler Dawson. She's written a true thriller. So let's move now to Notting Hill and this street of death and look at this the serial killer side.
I like the street of death. That's good. Okay, so for about the first third of the book, one of the characters, who is just like all the other Londoners, is stuck and struggling through this fog, is John Reginald Christie. who nobody knows at the time is a serial killer. He's killed at least 2 women by 1952. So during the war, he was having an affair with a woman, and in the middle of the affair, he strangled her and realized that he enjoyed it. And he buried her in his back garden. And, I mean, the story is incredible.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so gruesome and strange. And I am a true crime aficionado. I reported on true crime for different networks, so I get it, why people are interested in true crime. It takes a lot to surprise me, and he surprised me. So he planted plants above her. You know, she's buried not very deeply in his backyard. There's so much rubbish back there, it would have been difficult to find her. And then the following year, in 1944, he killed another woman, but his method became so interesting because he used coal gas to disable the women. So he met a woman named Muriel Eady in 1944, and she really had no reason to come home and visit him. They weren't having an affair. She didn't need his money. She had a boyfriend, but she had this cough from bronchitis, chronic bronchitis. And at the time, you know, there were frequent bouts of smog. And on top of that, about 80% of people in London smoked. So,
Wow.
yeah, it was incredible. So, you know, this is all kind of a toxic environment just on a daily basis. So she had this cough, and he said, hey, I have this cure, and why don't you come to my apartment? And, you know, I think you can sit down in my chair, and I can really help you breathe more easily. She agreed, and she came back to his apartment, and he had taken a glass jar and filled it with, you know, some kind of a perfumey, fragrant liquid that he mixed with water, and he had a tube coming from this glass jar, and he had her breathe it in and just said this was a concoction that was really going to clear out her lungs. I guess she didn't notice there was another tube that was coming from the glass jar that connected to his gas tap in the kitchen. And he released the gas. He had a bull clip, and he released it. And so not only is she breathing in this nice perfumey liquid, but she's also breathing in coal gas, which disabled her completely. He assaulted her, and then he strangled her. And he put her in the back garden next to the first woman. And apparently went on a hiatus for several years. And then we come to the case of wrongful conviction that we can talk about. We can talk about now, or we could talk about later. It's really...
Let's do it. Let's do it later.
Okay.
You describe him as quiet and meek, and how does he... so is there a Jekyll and Hyde characteristic to this? And also talk about he murdered his wife as well.
He did. So, as I said before, he in 1952 was just another person struggling through this fog. He frequented places, you know, where he could hire prostitutes. And in 1952, because of the war, there were so many women who were left without husbands, without boyfriends, but with children, that many of them felt forced to go into at least part-time prostitution. And Notting Hill was such a horrible place with high crime and gambling and prostitution rings that John Christie seemed like an okay guy, I think, to most women. He was awkward, quiet and unassuming, right, which is how we describe many serial killers. Someone who just kind of faded into the background. Nobody really, he didn't strike anyone as good or bad, just sort of, you know, quiet. And so in 52, he went out into the middle of the fog to resign from his job, and he had for several years. And I don't think it was apparent. He never told his wife Ethel about it. And he had made the plan that this was going to be the time where he was going to change his life forever. He was tired of his wife. Clearly, she used to visit her sister in Sheffield quite often, so he had the flat to himself so he could bring women back. And she stopped doing that. Her health had declined. So a few days after the fog, he strangled her and put her under the floorboards of their parlor. I guess he had run out of room in the garden. Who knows what he was thinking. I think he wanted, the indicator from his confessions was that he wanted to keep her close by to him. So he put her under the floorboards, wrapped her up. And it's so strange because the conditions were perfect to mummify bodies. It was really cold in their flat. They had very little heating. and it was really dry. So when he wrapped her up, and later the police found her, she was dry and almost mummified after 4 months. So later on we could talk about the other case that he was involved with, where the victims were found in the wash house, and it was the same thing, really dry, not moist conditions. So the bodies were preserved really well. So he in Notting Hill, as I said, women were willing to spend time with him or come back to his flat because he had money, and he was meek, and he seemed not threatening. And so I think in a time period and in a location where there were an awful lot of ruffians, really bad men, dirty men who really treated women disrespectfully, John Christie seemed like not such a bad catch.
And he sexually assaulted these women, but not his wife.
He didn't, no.
I thought it was interesting.
Well, I mean, I think if he had a normal sex life with his wife and didn't have sort of the strange background that he did, I think, that none of this would have happened, obviously. His background is what I would say is not surprising for a serial killer. He had an abusive father growing up. He had overbearing mother and overbearing sisters. He was humiliated when he was younger by girls saying that he didn't perform sexually very well. And he became very bitter and mad. And he was in World War I and was gassed by mustard gas and lost part of his voice. And so that didn't help. I mean, he was not an attractive man to begin with. His voice was squeaky. He was really awkward. And so I think all of that just combined into a very mad, bitter man, and this is how it manifested itself.
Yeah, and the you say not good looking, but the picture of him that you have in the book, he looks kind of distinguished, doesn't he? Maybe it's the suit he's in and everything.
It could be. And there's another picture that's not in the book, that he was a War Reserve policeman in World War II, and he looks kind of dapper in his, I mean, who doesn't in a uniform? A uniform can really improve someone's looks, but but he had a large forehead. People described that, and he had kind of awkward looking teeth, even for that time period when people didn't have a lot of dental work. And I think it was mostly he had a grimace. He didn't have a sincere smile. I think he just was one of those strange men. But boy, the priority back then for women was someone who wasn't going to smack him around. So he did not seem to be that kind of man, and he wasn't physically strong. He had back issues. Yeah. He had arthritis issues. So when he strangled women, he had to use rope or pantyhose just to get some kind of leverage, and he had to drag them, and it was very difficult to drag, kind of, especially his wife was a little heavier. It took a while to get her there, and so that's part of the circumstantial evidence in this case we'll talk about later, was the claim that he had dragged a woman down 3 flights of stairs that were very narrow, and it just doesn't seem very likely.
In the last minute here, talk again about how we have a serial killer. He kills 8 people in the end, maybe more, and the London fog kills 12,000, and the serial killer gets more press.
Oh, absolutely. And like I said, I think we see that today. The sexier, salacious headlines absolutely overshadow the real stories. I mean, let's face it, Smog is not the most alluring headline that you could think of. And this was they've been dealing with this for 200, 300 years, ever since London expanded in the 16th or the 17th century, and all of the wood went away and they switched over to coal. The pollution was very commonplace. So this wasn't alerting to anyone until months later, when the numbers started coming out of how many people had died week after week. But even then, it was just something that it was assumed it wasn't going to happen. The severity of it wasn't going to happen again. But a serial killer with headlines like The Beast of Rillington Place, and I was alerted when I saw the third body pulled out of the alcove of the kitchen, and I thought, well, this guy really is something special, even by my standards, for a serial killer. And of course, if I saw this on the cover of the New York Post, I'd pick that up. I'm not sure I would pick up a story about a fog that I had been used to for my entire life. Good point. You're listening to Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. In the next segment, we'll meet some of the victims of a serial killer.
We're back with Kate Winkler Dawson, the author of Death in the Air, the true story of a serial killer, the Great London Smog, and the Strangling of a City. And there's a lot of other victims. I want to start, I guess, with the ones that you alluded to briefly, which is, could there have been two killers in the same building even? Talk about that murder, the Beryl Evans and the Tim Evans, et cetera.
Sure. Okay. So in 1948, John Christie and his wife were the only occupants of 10 Rillington Place. So it was a 3-level tenement building, and the middle level was occupied by a man who had to go into the hospital. So he was there for a few months, and so that floor was empty. But a young couple moved into the top floor, Tim Evans and his wife, Beryl, and they had a little girl who was at the time just a few months old named Geraldine. And the Christies were a little wary of them. The man, Tim Evans, was young, and he drank a lot, and he and his wife argued a lot, and it became very physical, and there were a lot of witnesses that say he was an abusive husband, but he adored his daughter. So about a year later, and just to catch you up, John Christie has killed 2 women so far, and they're in the back garden, but nobody knows it, and he is still hanging out with prostitutes. About a year later, Beryl Evans and the little girl Geraldine go missing, and so does Tim Evans. And he shows up in Wales, where he's from, at his aunt and uncle's house. Unexpectedly, they haven't seen him for years, and he says, I need to stay with you for, a few days, if that's okay. So he told his aunt and uncle that, he had been in London, and he had visited London and seen his wife and daughter off, and they were traveling somewhere with her family, and that's why he came to Wales. So they wrote Tim's mother, who was their relative, and said, hey, do you believe this story? Tim's always kind of been a liar. And the mother wrote back and said, no, he's a liar. I rue the day I had him. He's a horrible person. Don't believe anything he says. So they read the letter aloud from his mother to him, and he immediately went to the police station and confessed to killing his wife and his daughter. What's so convoluted about this case is how much misinformation there was. So he said, I dropped them both, I strangled them, and I dropped them both down the drain in the front of the building of 10 Rillington Place, which just happened to be right in front of John Christie's parlor window. And so the Welsh police called the Notting Hill police frantically and say, this guy just confessed. Can you find this woman and the little girl? He says that he killed him in the top floor, dragged him down the stairs, and dropped him down a drain pipe, essentially. So the Notting Hill police rush over, and this is late at night, and John Christie hears all this banging and comes outside and inquires what happened. And they say, have you seen Beryl and Geraldine, your neighbors? And he says, no, I don't think so, but they could be at her mother's house. Here's the address. And so they're trying to get the lid off this drainage pipe, and it's not working. It's almost rusted shut. And so they call back to the Welsh police and say, this guy's full of it. There's no way he could have gotten this open. There's 4 of us here. We can't get this open. He's lying. And thus began this sort of litany of recanting and confession and inaccurate confessions, and it's just maddening to the Welsh police. They can't even stand it anymore. They think this guy, Tim Evans, is lying constantly, and they don't know what to believe. So then a series of what I consider Keystone Cop missteps happen, which is, the police office, the Metropolitan Police were told by the supervisor, you need to search everywhere. There's a little building in the back called a wash house, and you need to go to the back garden and search it. And one cop thought the other cop was supposed to do it, so several days passed where no one looked inside this wash house. This was a wash house where John Christie had temporarily stored both women who he had already killed several years earlier. So the John Christie is pacing in the back garden just beside himself, not sure what's happening, because he's got 2 women buried in the back garden. We don't know at this point whether he's involved with the murder of his neighbor's child and wife, but we know that he's stressed out because he has police walking over 2 women who he killed, 5, 6 years ago. So the police walk right past this strange post that's holding up the fence. And what the post was the femur bone of one of Christie's victims. His dog. I mean, it sounds horrible to laugh at, but this is one of those.
And nobody noticed it,
no,
right? No,
absolutely not. And it's just absurd that he did it. Absurd that he plants over these women's faces to begin with. But, his dog frequently liked to dig up bones, and the dog dug up one of the legs, and part of Christie's fence was falling down. So he took a bone and kind of strapped it to the side of the fence. And the cops walked right by it, and they didn't go into the wash house until several days later, when they went inside and find the wrapped up bodies of Beryl Evans and the little girl. So again, a reminder, Christie had stored women's bodies in there in the past. So all of this is very confusing because the pathologists never did a rape kit on Beryl when they got her back to the lab, because the police officer said, no big deal, don't do it, don't waste your time. The husband confessed, so why do a rape kit? If they had done a rape kit and found semen, it would have been another piece of evidence potentially against John Christie, who ends up later confessing to killing Beryl Evans and Geraldine. But at this point, Christie says, this guy is horrible. I'm willing to testify against him. He needs to be hanged for killing his wife and his child. They were really sweet. And so that's what happened. The Crown prosecutor put him on the stand, and Christie said, I've heard him threaten to kill his wife. I've seen him knock her around. And Timothy Evans says, I didn't do this. John Christie did it. But nobody believes him, because nobody knows their bodies in the backyard. And John Christie was a War Reserve policeman at the time. So Timothy Evans is convicted and hanged for killing his wife and his child. It's only 2 years later, in 1952 and in 1953, when Christie goes on the run in March of 53, and they pull out these bodies, that it occurs to anyone that, oh, wait a second, there's a serial killer at 10 Rillington Place. Maybe he's the one who's responsible for killing Beryl Evans and the little girl. So it is, again, just sort of this moment of clarity for the public, where they think, that the government has convicted and then ultimately killed the wrong man. I don't agree, personally, but, that was part of sort of my investigation. And conventional wisdom in the United Kingdom is in fact that this is a horrible case of wrongful execution. And a couple of his family members, Tim Evans' family members, were given money restitution from the government just a few years ago for this, travesty of justice.
And I think you say in the book that at about that time the death penalty is actually abolished.
It is, and it is right. So a man a journalist named last name Kennedy wrote a very famous book called 10 Rillington Place. It was turned into a movie, and he was advocating for the Evans family, and there was, it's about 65 or 66. There was a big push to abolish the death penalty because of a couple of high-profile cases that went awry. But really, it was the media latched on to the Timothy Evans case as just another example of why the UK shouldn't have the death penalty.
And
so that's what happened.
You think that Evans actually did it, that Christie was innocent here?
I do. I think now Christie, once all the bodies were pulled out, he confessed. I mean, he gave stupid reasons. He said that 3 women who he later killed after he killed his wife, and he was free to use the flat however he wanted to, he killed 3 more women and put him, wallpapered them into the alcove of his kitchen in a coal cupboard, ironically enough. He confessed to those. He said, well, they forced their way. It was self-defense, which, of course, is probably one of the stupidest defenses I've ever heard, but he sexually assaulted all 3 of them. He never mentioned Beryl Evans or the little girl until his attorney said, now think very carefully, Christie. Yeah. Do you think you had anything involvement in this case? And they were looking for an insanity defense. That's what they wanted. It was the only thing that was going to save his life. I mean, what kind of man would go on a killing spree and sleep very close to his wife, who was under the floorboards, and keep all these women surrounding him, except a crazy man, is what they claimed. And actually, his defense attorney said, do you remember, were you in Windsor during this particular time period? And there was a girl who went missing in Windsor. And the defensive attorney said, think very carefully. Do you think you could have been involved in that case? And Christie actually denied that and said, I don't hurt kids. That would never happen. So I don't believe that. I think the 2 major reasons that people say that that Timothy Evans was innocent, where Christie confessed, which again I say I don't particularly believe, because I think he would have confessed to anything to get out of the death penalty. And number two, no one believes that there could be two killers in the building at the same time. Now, two serial killers at the same time, no, I don't believe that. But a serial killer and, one of, thousands, if not even millions of men in London at the time who were abusive and could have snapped. I mean, that was very common. Yeah, I believe that. I mean, you could throw a rock and hit an abusive man in Notting Hill during that time period. So it's not out of the realm of possibility. For me, I think one of the strongest pieces of evidence that I confirmed with a present day pathologist is if we look at the photos of Beryl Evans from the pathologist in 1949 when she was found dead. The pathologist said, and my pathologist agreed, that she was hit in the face so hard that her lip could touch her nose, her top lip. So she was punched in the face. But the key here was, according to the evidence, it happened 20 minutes before she was killed. Now, do you really think that a woman would let a neighbor punch her in the face, not scream, not yell, no one heard any screaming or yelling, and stick around with him long enough to allow herself to be strangled later on? I don't believe that.
Also, it sounds like a rage killing then, which would obviously...
It does. And Christie had no reason to kill the little girl. I mean, I don't particularly think Tim Evans had any reason to kill her either, but between the two, I absolutely believe that Timothy Evans was more than capable of killing a little girl. It just wasn't in Christie's MO. And, of course, because the cops never did a rape kit on Beryl, we don't know if semen was present. We know when they exhumed her body several years later because of this case, there was no semen present. But, that's inconclusive. There were so many missteps with this case. That's incredible. They both confessed. They both recanted. They both gave the stupidest excuses for how, the murder occurred. Mm-hmm. And so you just don't know. And there was in 1965, there was a judge who, looked at all the evidence. It was requested because of this book that was written, looked at all the evidence again, and came up with what I think is one of the silliest conclusions ever, which was based on his idea of the evidence that Timothy Evans killed his wife, but not his daughter, that Christie killed a little girl. So they worked in concert, which is, I think, ludicrous.
Sounds ludicrous.
Tell
us now, so what happens to Christie?
He becomes a rock star for murderers. I mean, it's incredible. They call him Jack the Strangler, of course, based on Jack the Ripper. He leads the newspapers, BBC. It's amazing how well he took over the media. And I think he finally got the attention that he really wanted. He has pictures pinned up of himself in his jail cell, and he has women writing him letters. I mean, it's really incredible. It's a phenomenon that we see now where we have the celebrity killer. He confessed. It didn't work. The insanity defense didn't work. And he was ultimately executed. But he was executed against the kind of pleas of folks in the Labor Party who just wanted more information about the Timothy Evans case. They wanted to know, had they actually killed the wrong man? And it was sort of a rush. I think that the government really didn't want to admit that there could have been a case of wrongful execution. And so, Christie ended up dying about 9 months after the Smog, but from March until about July, the newspapers were just dominated by the story. And then even afterward, because while Parliament is debating air pollution, they're also debating this case and the death penalty and what should be done. And it was a vicious debate, and it just dragged on and on and on until almost, November of that year. And that's when another smog crept up, which wasn't as bad. I mean, there were several hundred people who died, but, the smogs didn't go away. And it was just this ongoing debate that just, that was completely overshadowed by this really bizarre serial killer. And
so he has no remorse?
No, he really doesn't. I mean, he not even for his wife. He defended himself. He said he woke up and his wife was having seizures, and he sort of put her out of her misery. And he didn't really have much of an explanation for the two women in the garden. He sort of conveniently forgot details. And then moving forward, the three women who he later strangled while his wife was laying under the floorboards, he said they forced their way into his flat, and he was defending himself. Of course, he never mentions that he sexually assaulted any of them. So,
do you think that he killed anybody else that they didn't? Were there more victims that were never uncovered?
Well, I don't think so, because he really he stayed consistent with where he put the bodies. He never put any bodies anywhere else. He loved being vague, and he said, well, there could have been more bodies. But again, that plays into, he wanted people to think he was crazy, so that he would be assigned to an asylum and his life would be saved and he could have some sort of semblance of a life. But, he liked keeping them all close to him. And so, and that's another point with the Beryl Evans, he really stuck with the same procedure. And his procedure was a sexual assault, a strangulation, and if he put women into the wash house, it was very temporarily, like he would have them in the ground within the first few hours. And Beryl Evans and the little girl were there for 2 or 3 weeks, and he just wouldn't have been that sloppy. So, all of this, it pieces together in this really strange circumstantial case. But I really don't think that he went out and killed any more women. It's very odd, though, that nothing happened with women between 1944 after he killed the second victim. I mean, you go on a hiatus for different reasons. I think he might have been satisfied just with hiring prostitutes. But you never know. He also just had horrible health, and he went through bouts where he couldn't work, and he had, problems with employment. So, you don't ever really know. I mean, right, when we see a serial killer that's really active and then they drop off, it's usually because they're in prison or they're dead or they've moved somewhere else and they weren't able to connect the cases. But in his case, he stayed around, and there's just no real rhyme or reason. But he was so consistent about where he put the bodies. It seems unlikely, but, you never really know.
And he was hung, right?
He was, yeah. Both and by the same executioner as Timothy Evans. There was only one man who was well known for executing people on behalf of the government.
Interesting. I guess the only thing that he said was sorry for any trouble I might have caused.
Yeah, there's one, but that was for his sister, nobody else.
So meanwhile, there were weekends when 900 people died on the pollution front. We'll talk about the moral of the story in our final segment. You're listening to Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. Our flagship station is 1490 WGCH Greenwich. It's our final segment with Kate Winkler Dawson, author of A True Story of Murder and Death. And to me, not the typical crime thriller, because there's a lot of moral of the stories here. And the first one is talk about how the smog was ended, the Beaver Commission to the Clean Air Act that eventually spread to us.
Yeah, the government wanted to appease the public. So Churchill's cabinet assigned a fairly well-known industrialist named Hugh Beaver, who later became known as the inventor of the Guinness Book of World Records. But he was considered a really even, fair, educated industrialist who took over this committee, and the government just said, give us some recommendations, not thinking that this was going to be any kind of a comprehensive report, really, because for a bankrupt government, what could really be done immediately about air pollution? So the Beaver Committee met for a few months and then came back with a really in-depth, comprehensive report that essentially said the government needs to allow different towns and sections within London, municipalities, to create smokeless zones where burning coal is forbidden, and that in industry there need to be tighter regulations. And they also provided subsidies for private homeowners to switch from coal burning to electricity or oil or gas. And so this immediately within 2 years of this being enacted, cut down on the amount of pollution. I mean, it was a pretty dramatic reduction. And so it was considered a success What's so interesting about the Beaver Commission, where I think that the one place they really faltered, was the office, the Ministry of Statistics at the time provided them with a chart, and the chart showed the amount of deaths from the smog. So the government had declared that smog deaths, quote-unquote smog deaths, lasted from the first day of the smog through the end of December. The problem was there were elevated deaths from January through March also that were absolutely related to the smog. But the government said, nope, our cutoff is December 31st. We're not going to say anyone who died afterwards died from the smog. So this is still an incredible number, December 5th through the end of December, 4,000 people died.
Wow.
But from January to March, there was an additional 8,000 people above the norm. I mean, I mean the norm from decades. So this was clearly related to the smog. So on this chart, it says that smog deaths last from December 5th to the beginning of March or the middle of March. And it says, 4,000 and then 8,000 smog deaths. The Beaver Committee had the chart switched. And the official report with the Beaver Committee says 4,000 dead by the end of December and then 8,000 more for an influenza epidemic, which never happened. So the government covered up the additional 8,000 deaths, and that, lasted until about 15 years ago when researchers at Carnegie Mellon said, no, that's not right. And they did research on the flu, and it wasn't present, and it was nowhere in the newspapers. And so it was a, kind of a government conspiracy, which, as we know, is not unheard of in our own government. So in 1956, the Clean Air Act came about and was signed by Parliament, and it immediately reduced, the amount of smoke because of the smokeless zones, and it became a blueprint for the rest of the world to follow. And in 1970, the United States had its own Clean Air Act.
And ironically by President Nixon, who you would not have expected. As we finish up on this section of it, now here we are in 2017, and President Trump is trying to unshackle coal, pull out of the Paris Climate Accord, gut the EPA. What does that say?
Well, I mean, maybe we haven't learned our lesson here. Hopefully we have. This was a very extreme example of data being covered up, of, a government that would have preferred to placate the public and have inaction rather than action. And, of course, now we have a government that prefers to take action actually against the environment. So, yeah, it's very disturbing. I think that people think if you can't see it, if it's not like, a gun to your head, that it's still not deadly and it still doesn't threaten your life, but it absolutely does. And so it's upsetting for sure. All
right. Now, the second big moral is this wrongful conviction. You're involved with the Texas Board for Actual Innocence.
Right.
Talk a little bit about coerced or false confessions.
Well, they're very common, but, people don't believe it. The general public doesn't believe that someone would actually confess to a crime. I will tell you this. I tell my students on the first day of class, if you get into trouble, do not talk to the police. Please call an attorney. Innocent people call attorneys. And we're not told that. You watch cop shows and they say, innocent people never call an attorney. That means you're guilty. And that's just not true. So false confessions happen all the time. It doesn't mean that the police are beating you. It just means you people are scared. And, of course, the majority of confessions are legitimate. But there are an awful lot of people in prison who shouldn't be there for various reasons, and not necessarily because they're murderers. It could be petty crime. It could be anything. And, of course, we know that in this country, if you don't have the money to hire a very aggressive attorney, that you're already in a bad situation to begin with.
We had a member, one of the kids in the Central Park Five we interviewed, and they confessed, as you know, under coercion without even being in the right part of the park where they could have killed her. Now, what about the opposite side of this when we get a dream team that gets someone like O.J. Simpson who's clearly guilty off?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's another unfortunate thing about our justice system, that money really does talk. Yeah. And there are incredibly talented attorneys who can morph the evidence or find technicalities, and that happens all the time too. So, right, I mean, you hope that there's a checks and balances system with our judicial system, and it just isn't present for an awful lot of people. So, and it's unfortunate, and that's why I say you do the best you can But I always say, hire an attorney, even if it's, a court-appointed attorney. You need somebody there to represent you.
It's been a fascinating book you put together. Tell us briefly, you like historical periods. Your next book is on the Gilded Age.
It is. It's on the Gilded Age. It's a Jekyll and Hyde character you kind of alluded to, John Christie. This is a true Jekyll and Hyde character who was a genius and very well respected, but he was also a vicious killer who killed his wife and his little girl and several other people. And he's incredibly interesting. Christie's crimes I thought were interesting, but I don't think Christie himself was an interesting character. This man just blows my mind, and so I'm very excited to dig into such a rich age.
Fascinating. When's that book out?
2 years, hopefully.
Well, we'll get you back on. Thanks to Kate Winkler Dawson. The book, Death in the Air, The True Story of a Serial Killer, The Great London Smog, The Strangling of a City. Kate's website is katewinklerdawson.com. This has been Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. We've got our podcasts available, WGCH.com. Also available on YouTube. Search Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell or Park City Productions 06604. And we'll see everybody next Monday evening at 6 for another edition of Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell, announcing a new crime show on Mondays at 6 p.m. on 1490 WGCH. All talk and all crime. The nation's biggest murderers were the go-to source for the Moxley murder and the Skakel appeals. Financial crimes on Wall Street. Inside the crimes of Russia's Putin and more. The facts, the forensics, the inside stories. From the host of Business Talk with Jim Campbell, it's Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. All talk and all crime. Mondays at 6 p.m. right after the Lisa Wexler Show on 1490 WGCH and WGCH.com anywhere.